Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Written for Admonition. We're picking up in our conversation today about entering the Promised Land, and specifically how Israel went about doing this, and more to the point, how God was able to bring this to pass in that nation, despite some of the issues and setbacks they faced along the way. We've been talking for the past 3 weeks about Moses and his leadership, and really looking specifically at how God used him, despite some of his own personal misgivings and failures that he had, but God was able to use him nevertheless to bring about his will, and that was a great lesson for us to consider because we saw the different dimensions of who Moses was in his leadership, and we see how he was really fitting to be a leader in God's service, even if he maybe not had the traits that you would typically associate with leaders. But springboarding from the conversation about Moses into the conversation now about entering the Promised Land, we've got to do a little bit of a review to get us up to speed about what we're talking about here, so that way we're all on the same page. The very first thing we have to understand, and the reality we have to wrap our minds around here, is that God's design for Israel did not just end at the Exodus. And what I mean by that is that God did not only intend to bring Israel out of bondage and then basically just say, you guys are free to do as you wish. He had more in mind than just that. Because his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, many centuries before the Exodus, did not just involve liberty from bondage. That was obviously part of it. If you look at places like Genesis chapter 15, God is explicit with Abraham that his descendants, the people of Israel, they're going to be in a land that is not theirs. They're going to serve that nation for many years, and God is going to bring them out with a strong arm. So we see as far back as Genesis 15 the anticipation of the Exodus, but we also see the anticipation of an inheritance in the Promised Land, or the land of Canaan. And so God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob he would deliver those descendants from the evil they would face in a land that was not theirs, but he would bring them back to the place where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob dwelt, specifically, again, Canaan, and allow them to inherit this land so that it would become their own. And they would disinherit and push out the nations that were there in the land of Canaan, and they would take it as their own possession, not by their own power nor their own authority, but rather by the power and authority of God. And so right off the bat, and really we talk about this before the Exodus, we talk about it during the Exodus and after the fact, we're seeing God's hand all throughout Israel's journeys. Everything they're doing, every place they go, it's all by God's divine decree, because he's the one guiding them along the way. He knows exactly the way they need to go. After all, God understands the way better than anyone else has the ability to understand. He has a perspective that no man could possibly have, so he's in the best position to guide his people, and that's precisely what he does. And the way that he does it is actually quite unique because, as we're going to find out here in just a moment from the book of Numbers, once again, he was guiding his people all throughout this time, trying to help them to get close to the Promised Land so he could bring to fulfillment his promise of that land so they could enter into it and inherit it just as he intended. Let's go ahead and take a look now at a place like Numbers chapter 9 and verses 15 through 23. And the reason I want us to read this text in Numbers chapter 9 verses 15 through 23 is quite simple, because I really think it labors to show us in detail what God was doing and how he was leading his people from the front and how insistent he was that they follow his commands in this respect so that way they would have a good outcome. It really goes to show that when his guidance is followed, that good things can result, although we are going to see some maybe not so bright spots to that end a little bit later in just a few minutes. But without further ado, let's take a look here at Numbers chapter 9. I'm in Numbers chapter 9, verses 15 through 23 here, so about the middle part of the chapter to the end of it, and this is what it has to say starting in verse 15. Now on the day that the tabernacle was raised up, referring back to the book of Exodus incidentally, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony. From evening until morning it was above the tabernacle like the appearance of fire. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle, after that the children of Israel would journey. And in the place where the cloud settled, there the children of Israel would pitch their tents. At the command of the Lord the children of Israel would journey, and at the command of the Lord they would camp. As long as the cloud stayed above the tabernacle, they remained encamped. Even when the cloud continued long, many days above the tabernacle, the children of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not journey. So it was, when the cloud was above the tabernacle a few days, according to the command of the Lord they would remain encamped, and according to the command of the Lord they would journey. So it was, when a cloud remained only from evening until morning, when the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they would journey. Whether by day or by night, whenever the cloud was taken up, they would journey. Whether it was 2 days, a month, or a year that the cloud remained above the tabernacle, the children of Israel would remain encamped and not journey, but when it was taken up, they would journey. At the command of the Lord they remained encamped, and at the command of the Lord they journeyed. They kept the charge of the Lord at the command of the Lord by the hand of Moses. Now, reading through this, just to be frank about what we just read, it's kind of repetitive. And it really seems to be proving the same point over and over again. It's somewhat strange when it comes across in our English translations. But what is this showing to us about God and his leadership over Israel? We understand that he used Moses for many things. He used Moses to accomplish great deeds in Israel. No question about that. But ultimately, as this indicates, and Moses would have written this, by the way, as a record of what God did, this goes to show that their journeys were completely dependent upon God's direction. And to their credit, they obeyed that for the most part. Now, again, we're going to see in a little bit that they were not always obedient to that, but that's going to come after this, not before it. So up to this point in Numbers chapter 9, they have kept God's command to only journey when he tells them to, and he tells them through the mechanism of this cloud and this pillar of fire. So they understand the way that he wants them to go based upon this, and he had communicated that back in the book of Exodus of what they should expect with these different emblems, so they would know what direction he wanted them to go. So their journeys here, going through places they had never been before, because again, they had lived all their lives in Egypt, and now they're coming out of that land and going into a land they've never seen before. Here God is guiding them along that journey. And the reason for the repetition here is to labor to show that and prove that Israel was completely dependent upon God in this time in the wilderness. They could not have made this alone. They could not have survived alone. They were totally dependent upon God's divine direction and guidance in this time of their lives. They needed him in this way. And God was happy to oblige. He was more than happy to show this to them. This was part of his means to fulfill his promise. And this is just one mechanism by which he's going to do that. So he's giving them every resource, everything they need to make it to the promised land and inherit it. They are not having to guess at this. They're not having to figure things out for themselves. They are following his command and his charge here in Numbers chapter 9, verses 15 through 23. So we make that point to then turn back to our slideshow here and talk about how God not only guided them through the wilderness and guided them to the border of the promised land, we're going to find out, but he even told them that once they get there, so once his divine guidance leads them into the land of Canaan or to the border of it, that they would be victorious as long as they put their trust in him. So God was clear all throughout his law. It's not going to be by your own power and by your own wisdom or your own military genius that you're going to be able to inherit Canaan. It ain't going to happen that way. It's going to happen because I'm going to give you the victory. We're not going to read it, but in Exodus chapter 23, verses 27 through 31, there's some interesting language that God uses to describe what he will do to Canaan to give it to the Israelites when they arrive there at that border. He says he's going to send the hornet before them. Or in that case, I believe it says hornets, so there's other passages that indicate hornet singular. It's interesting how that comes across in our English translations. But that aside, the point is about those hornets or hornet or whatever the case may be, that God is going to be the one driving this. He's going to be the one giving them the victory. It is not going to be Israel's might on its own. Now, they have a part to play, so let's not downplay that part. We're going to see that a little bit later under the leadership of Joshua. They have to take some initiative here. But nonetheless, it is God who is driving this forward. He's the one giving them these opportunities. He's the one bestowing this upon them. They are inheriting what he is giving to them. They just have to lay hold of that inheritance. But as we find out in the book of Numbers, despite these advantages, despite the fact that God had promised to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that he would give the Israelites land, despite the fact that he divinely guided them in the wilderness after they left Egypt, and really before they left Egypt and during the exodus from Egypt, despite that, despite the fact that he guaranteed Israel would be victorious against their enemies no matter how strong they were, as long as they put their trust in him, we're going to find great failure at the border of Canaan. Let's turn to our next slide here and understand what takes place there. So if we go back to the book of Numbers, specifically chapters 13 and 14, we find that Israel has come up to the edge of Canaan. They're about to enter the land, but they wanted to spy it out first. And to be more specific, God commanded them to send spies into the land first. And they were to go into the land for about 40 days to determine the lay of the land. And there's some practical reasons for that, of course. It's never a good idea to invade a land unless you have a good idea of what you're up against. So it's a matter of wisdom to do this. But it was also, in some respects, a test. Not a temptation, to be clear, because a temptation involves evil deeds, but a test of whether Israel would look to God and realize that no matter how things looked, God could make a difference here. That he could bring to pass his promise to fulfill what his word was, no matter how strong the people in the land of Canaan were. But as we find out in Numbers chapter 13, specifically the end of that chapter, even into chapter 14, that the spies, when they go out in the land, they return and they have their report, and only two, Joshua and Caleb, give a positive report and say that God is able to deliver the land of Canaan into the hand of the Israelites. The other 10 spies, they all, with one accord in that situation, say to the people of Israel, we can't do it. It's not possible for us to take the land. They would talk about how the people of the land are like giants in their sight, and they're like grasshoppers. They would talk about how mighty these cities are and just how impressed they were by what was happening there and how fearful they were about the inhabitants of the land, showing that they really didn't think that God could do what he promised. That it didn't matter that he had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all those years before that he would deliver his people into the land of Canaan. It didn't matter that he had guided them for all these years up to this point. It didn't matter that he had promised them that he would send the hornet before them to deliver the land of Canaan into their hands. None of that mattered to them. They were focused on what they could see rather than what they could not see. They were focused on the reality of the moment rather than the reality of God's divine power. And so we see a rebellion take place in Numbers chapter 13, verses 25 into chapter 14 and verse 4. To the extent that in Numbers chapter 14, the people gather together and they actually want to appoint a new leader, get rid of Moses, and go back to the land of Egypt where they were slaves. That's how severe this was and how major a rebellion this was. So don't ever think when you're reading those chapters that this was somewhat of a human issue. I mean, obviously there's human elements in this, but understand this was a serious act of rebellion. This was not something that was taken lightly because it was not a light issue. It was major. It was a rebellion against God. It was saying they didn't trust him to do what he said he could do. And that was a great folly on their part. And so we find in Numbers chapter 14, verses 26 to 35, that God is obviously very frustrated with the people of Israel for this reason, because he realizes exactly what this is. They're grumbling against him. They're complaining once again after all these years of being with him, about 2 years they had in the wilderness with God and having him lead them and provide for them and give them everything they needed, every advantage imaginable. And here they are at the edge of the land of promise, the land of Canaan, the place that he's been leading them to all this time. They're finally there, and they end up failing once again. It was greatly discouraging, obviously, for Moses and for Aaron and for God. And yet, despite that, and here's the incredible graciousness and mercy of God in this situation, he did not totally cast off the nation. Although his language may indicate that he wanted to do that, he simply did not. But what he said he would do is that generation would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, that being the generation that rebelled against him, and they are going to die in the wilderness. Their carcasses will be strewn about in the wilderness. They will not die in a settled place. And the generation after them, which would be the generation even after Joshua and Caleb, they would be the ones that would go into the land of promise, and they would inherit the land that their fathers failed to inherit. And so we find there that despite the failure of Israel, God's graciousness and mercy once again comes to the surface. That he is still willing to bear with them and still willing to carry out his promise despite the great transgression of his people on this occasion. Despite the fact they simply did not trust him to do what he said he could do, he's still willing to give them another opportunity and to allow them this chance to enter the land of promise even after a generation passes. So, all that being said now, after this failure here at the edge of Canaan, they're going to wander for 40 years. There's going to be a lot that happens in that intermediate time. Again, 40 years is a long time. It's an entire generation's worth of time and history taking place. And yet during that time, we find that in Numbers chapter 21 specifically, and I have the verses listed there if you'd like to read those, you have God giving Israel numerous victories, not necessarily in the land of Canaan proper, so they're on the other side of the Jordan River. So they're on the east side of the Jordan River, not on the west side just yet. That's going to come a little bit later in the book of Joshua, but they're on the east side of the River Jordan, and he's going to give them numerous victories that allow them to take over certain periods, or certain plots of land rather, and that land is going to be handed over to the 2.5 tribes a little bit later down the road, which we will talk about at some point in the future. And we're going to find out something else interesting here too. So God has given them numerous victories on the other side of Canaan, not necessarily in the land proper, but then we also find this out, that God is not going to use Moses to lead the people of Israel into Canaan, but rather use Joshua for that purpose. Because we find in a place like Numbers 20, or chapter 20, that Moses failed God when God had commanded him to speak to the rock so that water would pour forth for it, for the people of Israel. Moses instead became angry with the people for their complaints after all those years of complaining. He strikes the rock instead of speaking to it as God commanded, and for that he was punished as well. and that punishment specifically said that he would not enter the land of Canaan, he would not inherit the land of promise, and he would not have the privilege of leading the people into the land as he had intended. So it's going to become Joshua's responsibility now, and he is going to rise to the occasion. Now, we may not know much about Joshua at this point, so let's just pause for a moment and understand who he is. So Joshua is Moses' assistant. So what that basically means is he was his helper. He was there to support Moses in whatever was taking place. He was there to help him in different areas, and you see this as far back as like Exodus chapter 17. And in that case, the help was a bit more physical in some cases. So he's actually out there leading on the field of battle while Moses, along with Aaron and Hur, are up on that hill, and Moses is extending his arms out to give the victory to Israel by God's command. So Joshua is already serving in that interesting capacity there of being a military commander, serving with Moses in some respects. And then we also see him a little bit later in the book of Exodus going up with Moses on the mountain of God, not all the way up like Moses did, but he was still part of the way up. So he was not involved in the situation that takes place with Aaron and the golden calf. So all that is to say that Joshua plays an interesting part in Israel's history, and specifically with relation to his relationship to Moses. And so in Numbers chapter 27, verses 18 through 23, which we will not read, but we'll just summarize here, God specifically told Moses, and Moses apparently agreed to this as well and had the same idea, that Joshua would be the one that would have God's Holy Spirit come upon him, and he would then be appointed to lead Israel after Moses' death. So we see that Joshua was already being established to be Israel's next leader, and again, he would be the one to lead Israel into the land of promise and take over Canaan as God intended. And that then leads us into the book of Joshua proper. So we're going to spend some time here in Joshua chapter 1, and we're going to look here at what happens immediately following Moses' death. And we're going to see what God's charge to Joshua was and whether or not Joshua rose to the occasion. We already have a hint that he did, but let's talk about it nonetheless. So we're going to go to Joshua chapter 1 here, and we're going to look at verses 1 through 9, which is basically the introduction of the book. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses my servant is dead. Now therefore, arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving to them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and to the great sea toward the going down of the sun, shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have good success. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. So this is the Lord's command to Joshua. So Moses has passed away, and now Joshua is being charged by God to carry out the command of God, to go forth into the land as God promised, to inherit this land, to fight against the enemies of God, to take from the Canaanites the land that was being revoked from them and given to the Israelites, and how God would be with Joshua and the people of Israel so long as they kept his charge and fulfilled their end of the covenant that he made with them. And God is clear here that as long as you follow me and as long as you trust in me, no one's going to stand before you. I mean, look at verse 5. Think of yourself as a military commander and hearing this from God, that he is promising this to you. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. And then he says at the end, I will not leave you nor forsake you. What an unshakable promise that would be in the ears of someone who is in this position. That did not make the task any less intimidating from a human perspective. But once again, it goes back to what we've already talked about. God told Israel, he promised to them, I am going to go before you. I will be the one fighting your battles. You have a part to play, yes, but I'm going to be the one to give you the victory. You don't have to worry about this. And so God is reaffirming all of that here to Joshua, everything we've already talked about. The covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is brought up in this conversation that God has with Joshua. He talks about his promise to be with Joshua and to give him the victory. He talks about how he's going to take care of them and guide them to where they need to go. They don't need to be concerned about the future because God holds that in his hand. Now, how does Joshua end up responding to this? He responds positively. He takes the charge and he fulfills that charge that God gives to him. And so as the history of Joshua unfolds here in this particular book that bears his name, you see just that happening. There were a few hiccups here and there, like with the land of Ai and them having some problems there with Achan and his sin. But nonetheless, on Joshua's part, he was quite successful. And so we find that through Joshua, God is able to give Israel numerous victories. He's able to give them victory at the city of Jericho. He's able to give them victory at Ai after the issue there with Achan is resolved. He's able to give them victory in the north of Canaan, in the south of Canaan, in the west, in the east, no matter where it is. The people of Israel succeed because God is with them, and they're finally bringing to pass, again, through God's help and through his divine protection, bringing to pass his promise that he made all those years before in his covenant to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. And so at the end of Joshua's section here about his history, in Joshua chapter 12, verses 7 through 24, there's a list of kings that the people of Israel overthrew. And just to overthrow one king in the ancient world was quite a feat. But to overthrow 31 kings along with their people, that takes something important and something special that people cannot just conjure on their own. That is something that only God can bring about in a people's life and in a nation's life. And that's precisely what you see happening in the book of Joshua. Now, I'll confess to you that the book of Joshua can sometimes be a bit difficult to read from a modern perspective because of our own ideas about how things ought to be. But nevertheless, it's a record of God's faithfulness at the end of the day. It's a record of what he was able to accomplish for his people, and it's a record of what he will do for his people, and how far he is willing to go, and just how much he cares to bring to pass his promises and to not let anything interfere with that. So on that same point, let's go to our final slide here for this conversation, and I want to make this point as crystal clear as we can. God brought to pass his covenant. He brought to pass his promise that Israel would inherit Canaan. And that is something that Joshua himself testifies to. Now today we have people who would allege otherwise and say that the land promise that he had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still pending because Israel did not inherit all of Canaan. But that's not quite what the text actually says. And I believe that's an important point for us to realize this in Old Testament history, that God did fulfill his will in giving Israel the land of Canaan. They did inherit it. There's no question about that. So don't just take my word for it. Let's take a look here at the book of Joshua, chapter 21, verses 43 to 45, and let's consider what this says. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers. And not a man of all their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. So the Lord fulfilled his word and his promise to give to Israel the land of Canaan. There's no question about that. This selection of verses could not be any clearer to that end that God did fulfill his will. And he did give to his people rest. He did give to them peace. He did enable them to take the land and to have that possession and to dwell within it and to have peace and prosperity. So the very first lesson that we learn there is God's enduring faithfulness. The fact that he was willing, even amid human failure in Israel, even amid their rebellion, their lack of trust, their complaints, all of the issues they had in the wilderness, that God was still faithful to them and still committed to bringing to pass his will in that covenant he had made, and how he was going to uphold his end of the bargain even when Israel simply did not want to do the same on their part. But we see his enduring faithfulness, his, as the Old Testament says in many places, steadfast love. And that is really at the heart of what you're seeing here in this situation. So again, we can get bogged down in so many details, but let's not lose sight of the fact that God bringing to pass his promise to give his people the land of promise is indicative of his steadfast love, his enduring faithfulness to his people. But there's a second lesson that we can also gather from this as well that's important, not only to the Old Testament, but even to the New Testament. So God gave to his people rest. He gave them this inheritance. He blessed them abundantly in this area of life. And yet the rest they had was not permanent. And what I mean by that is to say that the land periodically would have invasions. It would have different issues that would come up. They were never quite secure. They had problems that entered the picture that forced them to act and to defend themselves, and it was never a restful situation. There were periods of time that it was, but it was not a constant rest. There was something else in the future that God had in mind that was not necessarily a physical rest as they have here in the land of Canaan, but there's the anticipation in the idea of the land of promise of something greater down the road. And that will bring us into the New Testament, talking there about Jesus and what he provides, talking about heaven itself. So many conversations we could have there about the rest that's available through Christ, not only in eternity, but obviously that's also in view as well. So again, let's remember, as we think about how the Israelites entered the land of promise, that it goes to show God's guidance, his commitment to his promises, his enduring faithfulness, his steadfast love. I hope this lesson has enlightened you about how the Israelites came into the land of promise and the circumstances that led to that situation, how they failed in many cases, but also how they succeeded. And we'll continue this conversation in the next week, talking about the book of Judges, where much of what we've talked about in terms of success here in the book of Joshua is going to be somewhat rolled back. But we'll have a good conversation about that nonetheless to understand the cycle of the Judges and see what happens when you have people who are not like Joshua and not like Moses, who simply do not have the level of commitment that they should and are simply ignorant of God and his ways. But that will have to wait until next week to have that conversation. As always, I thank you for your time today. I hope this has benefited you in some area, and we'll talk soon. Thank you.